The video game industry is a billion-dollar inerrant business seemingly nearly free of consequences for its wrongdoings, raking it millions upon millions of dollars more than ever than the film industry and the music industry. There's a certain strangeness to see then how oftentimes the video game industry still somewhat has to rely on intellectual properties made by other industries. Don't get me wrong, you at least played one licensed game in your life. So for any of the console generations that have ever existed in your lifespan, and I know a lot of us did at some point, even the shovelware titles for any console that's a lazy cash grab on a movie tie-in license of the time. Licensed video games will always be there in the gaming industry, like a bunch of cockroaches lingering in the ever-infested industry filled with business malpractices and layoffs. Lots of layoffs. Because at the end of the day, what drives any AAA game company to make these games is the same that drives any AAA game company to do an exploitative business practice. Join me on this journey of shock and awe in the quest to figure out what drives the gaming industry to keep creating these licensed games and the brief history behind them. But first...
But JMAA, how does one make a licensed game, you pedantic bitch?
Like any business decision in the gaming industry, using movie, book, comic, or even anything licenses usually happens for all sorts of reasons and in all sorts of ways. Let's just say that some licensed IPs are better than others when it comes to how profitable they are for a gaming company, and a lot of IPs were way less valuable than others to the point of attracting way less licensors. This isn't to say that those less valuable IPs have no value, and I mean probably look at something like the B movie or Shrek and try to tell yourself that maybe they have at least no historical value by themselves. Some IP owners, in order to even still make some money from these small IPs, they bundle up the IP into a big value pack so they can hope to sell them in the bulk. So when a game publisher reaches them, instead of licensing something more specific like, say, I don't know, Torrente, publishers can spend a little bit more and get a value pack of Torrente, AC/DC, El Día de la Bestia, Padre No Hay Más Que Uno, A Todo Tren, and every single franchise Santiago Segura has ever been. So for a discount, a game publisher can make a licensed game for any of these franchises. Still, the game publisher also has to do a tiny favor to the licensed seller, and that is that the licensed seller needs to get a cut of the revenue made by the games made about their own franchises. Oftentimes, game publishers are left off with a whole bunch of licenses left over from these grab bags, so eventually they have to also pitch another licensed game for a license they got left around. Maybe when they originally made an open world GTA style game about Torrente, they have a limited time to create, say, a rhythm game based on AC/DC, or a horror game based on El Día de la Bestia, or any other type of game based on the other licenses they got lying around. And IP licenses, or rather, the selling of IP licenses to a game publisher work pretty much like a rental for really rich corporations. They have a limited time before the license expires. A case example of a game that could be a licensed game if it didn't expire on the game developer's wishes would be Doom. Yes, that Doom. Doom originally was intended to be an Aliens licensed game that was about to be a tie-in for the movie, but because its software didn't have the time before the Aliens license expired from the movie studio it belonged to, we got stuck in the lifelong timeline where Doom is not the Aliens game it was designed to be, and yet somehow it was such a popular game that it birthed a mainstream FPS genre aside of being even playable on God Bacteria or something. These smaller IP value pack grab bags and the constant licensing in bulk of these, as you might see later in this video, are the main reason why there are so many shovelware licensed games lying around in the video game catalog of so many gaming generations, especially for a certain time periods. A lot of them are pretty much obscure games that do not sell that well compared to other sorts of non-licensed IPs like Crash Bandicoot, Dark Souls, or even Call of Duty. Licensed games have existed ever since the very inception of video game itself. Sega in 1976 created an arcade game based on Fonz, a rebranded version of the video game Motocross. They only swapped the main character for Fonzie from the TV show Happy Days. I bet you never heard of that one before. But later in the 80s, one licensed game will prove nearly fatal to the gaming industry. And it's the phase of that not only haunts my nightmares, but also haunts the very nightmares of the gaming industry as a whole, including but not limited to Nintendo and more specifically, Atari. The 80s will be for many what will be considered to be the real birth of the video game industry, and the time it nearly extinguished itself to later resurrect like a phoenix, like a proverbial Jesus Christ after being crucified, dying for our sins, later to resurrect and ascend into the heavens of infinite gaming profit. Atari was once the king of the video game industry in the 80s. Their game catalog, however, didn't have, as far as I know, too many licensed games, for some exceptions. Most of these games were probably generic sports game titles like tennis, football, or soccer, or original sort of IPs like Pitfall. The Atari 2600 reigned the industry for a while, until that time where it tripped on its stick and fell off on an electric fence, electrocuting itself and leading Atari itself to be in a perpetual coma. Let me tell you that tale. In 1982, E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial was a massive movie hit in Hollywood, not just in terms of movie ticket sales, but also in the sales of merchandise and tie-in products. It was also my childhood phobia, so thanks Spielberg for fucking nothing. A lot of corporations, including Atari itself, saw the massive success E.T. had, and Atari itself licensed the IP from Universal to make a licensed game about the butt-fuckingly scary alien that somehow charm a generation of children, and Atari pretty much aimed to sell it during Christmas sales that year. So when Atari realized they only had 5 weeks for that, they hired a high-esteemed programmer Howard Scott Warshaw to get the game in just that, 5 weeks. Knowing this, there was a pretty tight deadline for a video game development back in the day. You might want to guess what happened next. A. The game saw commercial success and the industry moved on with Atari at the helm. B. The game was made at sales and most people forgot about it, being relegated to a rather obscure release. Or C. The video game crash of 1983. If you guess C, then consider yourself earning a Nobel Prize for obviousness. The game was a commercial failure. Since it was a rush release with such poor quality, it was deemed unplayable by critics and players. Also because it was far away from the movie's release hype, when with its failure, it triggered the infamous video game crash of 1983, leading Atari and other game companies to bankruptcy and subsequently leading Atari to bury in shame the unsold copies of E.T. for the Atari 2600 alongside other games in the Alamogordo Desert, only to be dug up like decades later, further confirming the burial was not just a gaming urban legend. The ironic part of this is that when looking up the Wikipedia article for licensed games, the picture of the dug up E.T. Atari cartridge sold shop in the front page is a stark reminder of what the whole licensed game industry might doom the industry into one day. The crash, however, did barely affect Japan's video game market, and its video game industry soon took the lead when in 1985 Nintendo released worldwide its Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES for friends, rebinding the failing gaming industry. Nintendo made sure its console will not trigger such a catastrophe again, as according to their particular Nintendo's seal of quality on nearly every NES game in existence. I'm pretty sure Nintendo's idea of someone making a game without the seal of quality will be like the merchant from Resident Evil 4.
Got something that might interest you.
I'm pretty sure that seal of quality that stopped bad quality licensed games like E.T. from popping up on the NES, right? Right? No! Let me introduce you to LJN, the Rainbow of Death. LJN Toys Limited was founded in 1970 by a man called Jack Friedman, and LJN was so good, Jack Friedman left to found THQ and Jack Pacific. Most of the stuff LJN is well known for is for selling WWE and ET toys and merchandise to kids in the 80s. But in 1987, they became a games publisher for games developed by companies you might as well know very well, such as Atlas, Beam Software, and Rare, especially making shovelware licensed games for the NES. Some of the NES game catalog involve a whole lot of WWE games, but most of these games are cheap license games designed to cash grab on popular 80s movie franchises and the sort. Friday the 13th, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Beetlejuice, Jaws, The Karate Kid, all fucking garbage. If you've seen a typical ABGN episode, you know what I'm talking about. Games that are frustrating to play, even low quality, to meet just enough hype window around this IP for a quick buck. They might as well have the goal to make a second E.T. game for the NES, but we're blessed to not live in that timeline. When LJN was making NES games, it was owned by MCA Incorporated until 1990, when ownership passed to Acclaim Entertainment, where it lasted 4 full years before Acclaim pulled an EA on LJN and closed LJN in 1994, only to briefly reuse the name in a game in the year 2000. LJN is now, since 2021, a husk of its former self, owned by Jazzwares, just to sell wrestling action figures, just to show that time is a flat circle. Ah yes, the 90s. Now we're in my own territory. It's quite incredibly baffling how the same decade that brought us Doom, Quake, Duke Nukem 3D, Crash Bandicoot, and the first Diablo also brought us a whole myriad of licensed games, especially for consoles like the PS1, that graced us such gems as A Bug's Life. Okay, sure, we got unironically golden nuggets such as GoldenEye 64 here and there, but there's a particular thing about consoles like the PS1, and it's the main reason why the PS1 destroyed their competition swiftly. The CD technology that PS1 had and its hardware allowed for much cheaper development costs for the console. You could just go in and see something in full real 3D even, and then burn it in a regular CD that cost literal pennies back then. CD technology was also prevalent in the PC gaming industry, as PC gaming was more legitimized with games such as Doom or Quake, birthing the real origin of the mainstream FPS genre, so developing for PC was even probably as cheap as developing for the PS1. Unluckily for us back then, it meant as well that as costs for the game development of these two particular platforms especially cheapened, so there was a start in the rise of bare minimum licensed PC and PS1 games such as A Bug's Life for the PS1. Of course, I wouldn't forget to mention the obvious sewage like Superman 64, the famous game where you navigate Superman barely through low poly rings. And look, even companies like Disney started making their game publisher branches such as Disney Interactive back then. That's going to become a trend later. The floodgates were starting to open to pour in the low-effort licensed cash grab games into the gaming industry. The special issue here is that nobody still could tell because in the 90s especially, the internet was still a bit of a commodity for fucking nerds. The decade of the PS2 and the Xbox was surely a golden age for the amount of games that were released back in said decade. It was also the decade of the Nintendo Wii, but you know everybody hates when Nintendo is trying to so hard to be different. Everybody knows that true 2000s classics such as Grand Theft Auto 3, Metal Gear Solid 2, Final Fantasy X, and God forbid if you forget about Halo. Halo and be thy name. But everybody tends to forget about the huge mass of already forgotten games that were released in this very time period. Do you want to know how many games does a PS2 have? Over 4,000 games. That's way more games than the PS5 and PS4 combined. The original Xbox had nearly 1,000 games on its catalog, which still pales in comparison to the Xbox 360's catalog of over 4,700 games. The Wii had 2,500 plus games, and the Nintendo DS, the original one, had over 2,300 games. If we do a rough calculation of the greatest sum of just the games of these aforementioned consoles, we roughly get over 14,500 games to play in that time period, and without counting the Nintendo shit cube, where all the mobile and browser games that were starting to be available by that time, alongside the resurging indie titles. You got enough games to fill up roughly 6 years of your life minimum. If granted that every game takes a minimum of 4 hours to complete, which might honestly be the Angry Joe tier standard of game length. But the sad news of this is that most of this game collection is licensed games and shovelware. Licensed games shovelware especially. Again, there are some hidden gems such as The Simpsons Hit and Run, SpongeBob and the Battle for Bikini Bottom, Chronicles of Riddick, and just maybe Spider-Man 2 for the PS2, considering its meme status for solely its pizza music. But then you have to navigate through such track of shovelware licensed games that are incredibly subpar, especially for the PS2, which apparently attracted this sort of games like an infestation of cockroaches. I mean, will you remember such a classic such as The Chronicles of Narnia, Prince of Caspian, or even games like Shrek Super Slap? I'm sorry, Barbie Groom and Glam Pops? Shrek Extra Large? You know, the game where you can make Shrek fart and burp? This will be not the first time the industry will be oversaturated with garbage games, but it just comes to show that, like the previous console generations and decades, quality control was not a priority for most of these game companies. And I mean, look at you, Steam. Aside from that, this will be the time period where platforms like YouTube will be founded in 2005, leading to the time period where the birth of the angry video game reviewer will begin, leading to more scrutiny to bad quality licensed games like the aforementioned NES LJN ones. In the late 2000s, licensed games, especially the crappy ones that are low effort and constitute the bare minimum of a commercial product, start to die down, as future console generations and releases will prove that the AAA industry of games will become more expensive given to the rising budget of games, especially the rising budget of bigger IP licenses. By this decade, game publishers and the store have started agreeing on the idea that maybe licensing big budget IPs for their games is kind of a risque move compared to already well established original IPs from said publishers. Maybe in terms of licensed games, there are some golden exceptions like the Batman Arkham series that started earlier in 2009 that coined game journalists from IGN the phrase, "It really makes you feel like Batman." But most of the efforts went on coining the original IPs of sorts such as Dark Souls or Minecraft or maybe even later games like Among Us. This is the same decade where Fortnite made its debut and honestly was part of the whole changing paradigm of how these games were approaching the consumer in terms of more predatory monetization, if not just outright selling them broken games, especially for licensed games. The Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War games, which is a byproduct of Warner Brothers making their own game publisher branch, and two games made by the same game studio that brought us originally Blood in the 90s, a sign as well that God is dead, are games which not only patented for the Warner Brothers hands only their nemesis system to the detriment of game devs who will benefit from such system, but also rife with predatory microtransactions like the AAA games of the time period. And let's not forget trap like Aliens Colonial Marines, created by Greasy Randy Studios, aka Gearbox, which is a prime example that by this time period, AAA game companies will start selling you unfinished rush games to make a quick buck on the movie IP licenses they're based on. And then the Alamogordo Atari cartridges silently rolled in their graves and screamed, "Did we learn nothing?" The gaming discourse on the internet will grow more powerful, if not just about the growing concerns of sexism and diversity in gaming. It will be about how games like these are the sign of the decline of the games industry. But sure, at least we got Doom 2016 and Cuphead, right? COVID pandemic this, COVID pandemic that. Sure, the COVID pandemic surely has slowed down the games industry for a bit, and it's clearly evident when we already got distracted with stuff like Doom Eternal or whatever Cyberpunk 2077 was on release. It's clearly evident that licensed games are more reserved for the lower valued, lesser IPs that are bought in bulk in value packs by budget game publishers and churn out mostly into garbage. Don't get me wrong, there are exceptions. Spider-Man 1 and 2 for the PS5 are great games, and they are a testament of what Spider-Man 2 for the PS2 used to be, but then there's the trash. Marvel's Avengers, a game published by Square Enix, was so bad of a game with tons of predatory monetization that its live service was killed mere months after its release. Then there are shovelware like Popeye the Sailor game, which barely constituted a bare bones game, which we all collectively forgot it existed. And then there's stuff like Rise of Kong and Lord of the Rings Gollum, which have never faced the light of sun. I think I already discussed this in a temporary defunct JMAA Live Deluxe podcast with Connie, but if your Gollum game has not only an elf character with the same IGCs than Gollum, but also the devs misspelled Lord of the Rings in an apology JPEG on Twitter, I don't think I want to hear about your Gollum game no more. And then Rise of Kong will be a prime example of how not to make licensed games in this time and period. Because let me present you to Game Mill, the 2020's equivalent of LJN. Game Mill will be a game publisher whose purpose is to churn out game prototypes without any aim to later buy and bulk value backs of IP licenses, mostly from undervalued IPs like King Kong and such, and slap them into these prototypes so they can produce literal shovelware. Jim Stephanie Sterling covered the Game Mill topic in more detail, but let me summarize this by saying that Game Mill is to game publishing what Illuminati is to video essays if she was in a Monster Energy fueled sugar rush. If it wasn't clearly evident in this, we might start seeing a pattern here which keeps repeating itself. If there's not going to be an imminent video game crash again like in 1983, at least there's gotta be one happening under our noses without anybody noticing. Because these licensed games, alongside the rest of the industry mob practices, are not a sign of a healthy game industry. The reasons why these licensed games were and are being made even today are the same reasons why there are massive layoffs at game companies when the AAA game industry is exploiting every form of predatory monetization possible, and why the games industry has a more visible problem of unethical business practices. It's all money. It was what I'm trying to say. The usual it's all capitalism at work. Maybe there's going to be a potential video game crash again like in 1983, but the game industry is entirely too busy trying to chase the dragon of infinite revenue growth by not just committing mass layoffs, but also cutting as many corners as possible and finding new ways to exploit the consumer base financially. And there's not a single effort made by the government or any agency in power to put regulations or anything that are designed to stop these mob practices. I don't want another boomer who lived since World War II to tell me what's right or wrong on my video games, let alone anyone who doesn't fully understand what video games actually mean. And let's face it, the indie game industry has so little power in this, and is so busy with their internal dramas that it's impossible they will rescue the industry at this point. So, if nobody is going to stop the industry from facing another crash like in 1983, who will? Nobody